Most people were taught that the modern Middle East was shaped by great battles, discipline, and diplomatic treaties. We are told that in November 1917, the British Empire simply issued a statement of goodwill, known to history as the Balfour Declaration. A short letter containing just 67 words, written on Foreign Office stationery. From to generations of students, presented as an act of pure ideology, from a moral promise, or an exercise in imperial benevolence. But on the battlefields of Europe, and inside the quiet rooms of Whitehall, an entirely different reality was unfolding. By late 1917, the British Empire was spending over £7 million a day to keep its war machine alive. Its physical gold reserves, once the bedrock of global trade, were draining across the Atlantic Ocean. Its overdraft accounts with private Wall Street banking houses hitting absolute credit ceilings. And for the first time in 2 centuries, from the world's largest empire, facing the terrifying specter of sovereign financial insolvency. When an empire runs out of money in the middle of a world war, diplomacy stops being about morality. It becomes an urgent auction, credit for diplomatic leverage, profits from, and for survival. To understand why those 67 words were written, we must look past the polished surface of official history. We have to open the dusty Treasury ledgers of 1914, follow the private telegrams between London and New York, and trace the hidden lines of an imperial debt crisis. Before the summer of 1914, from the British pound sterling was the undisputed master of international commerce. It was not merely paper. It was backed by the gold standard, unshakable promise that any banknote could be redeemed, our physical gold at the Bank of England. London was the clearinghouse of the world, from the supreme creditor nation, financing railways in South America, huts in Asia, and trade across every ocean. Irish statesmen operated under the supreme conviction that financial supremacy alone had to deter major global conflict. When war erupted in August 1914, prevailing orthodoxy in the British cabinet was simple: business as usual. After the war, politicians assured the public, fire, be sharp, decisive, and over by Christmas. Financial planners calculated costs based on the 19th century model, small expeditionary forces, limited artillery barrages, and brief naval skirmishes. Catastrophically wrong. And in weeks, the Western Front devolved into an industrial slaughterhouse, vast meat grinder consuming millions of high explosive shells, tons of steel, and miles of barbed wire. Financial burn rate of modern industrial warfare, every actuarial model ever conceived. Husman, the British government, which had spent roughly £200 million annually before the war, suddenly found itself burning through that entire budget, in less than a month. Taxes could not cover it. Buys from domestic war bonds, marketed to patriotic citizens with brass bands and posters, that only soak up a fraction of the liquidity required. Austria, more critically, Britain was no longer fighting alone. It had become the financial guarantor, the banker of last resort, the entire Allied coalition. France needed British credit to purchase coal and raw materials. From Imperial Russia, economically fragile and diplomatically unstable, hired massive sterling loans, simply to keep its peasant armies armed on the Eastern Front. Italy, lured into the conflict in 1915 with secret territorial promises, demanded continuous infusions of British cash to prevent national bankruptcy. London was not just manufacturing munitions. It was underwriting the survival of 3 separate empires. And as the months dragged on into 1915 and 1916, devastating truth became undeniable inside the Treasury. The British Empire was running out of physical gold. Industrial warfare required raw materials that the British Isles could not produce in sufficient quantities: American copper, Canadian wheat, and Texan oil. To purchase these essential war supplies, British pounds were useless unless they could be converted into American dollars. The United States was officially neutral, but its industrial capacity was overwhelmingly tied to the Allied war machine. To manage this gargantuan supply chain, The British government made a momentous decision in early 1915. It appointed the private Wall Street banking house of J. P. Morgan & Co. as its sole purchasing agent, and an exclusive financial syndicate manager in North America. Every contract for artillery shells, half of every shipment of grain from the Midwest, and every tanker of crude oil flowed through the Morgan desks at 23 Wall Street. Initially, Britain paid for these purchases by shipping physical gold bullion across the Atlantic on heavily escorted naval cruisers. Kites of gold bars from the vaults of the Bank of England hauled onto warships at Liverpool, puffed from steam through submarine-infested waters, and unloaded under armed guard in New York. By mid-19 that gold pipeline was running dry. London then forced British citizens to surrender their foreign securities, American railway stocks and municipal bonds, thus liquidating the accumulated private wealth of the Victorian era, and maintained the dollar exchange peg. Possible, when the marketable securities were exhausted, only one tool remained: massive, uncollateralized private borrowing. J.P. Morgan & Co. organized massive syndicate loans, putting hundreds of millions of dollars in British and French war bonds, from on the American market. By the autumn of 1916, Britain was borrowing roughly $250 million a month, private American creditors. Follows the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, Reginald McKenna, looked at the Treasury books and issued a chilling private warning to the cabinet. By early 1917, the British Empire would be financially exhausted. Empire's sovereign credit was hanging by a single, fragile thread. And then, in November 1916, a thread nearly snapped. The Federal Reserve Board in Washington, concerned about the astronomical volume of unsecured foreign debt flooding the American financial system, issued a public warning to American banks, advising them against purchasing further short-term Treasury bills from European belligerents. The impact in London was catastrophic. Scottish overdraft facilities in New York froze overnight. Pound sterling dropped sharply against the dollar. Sir Cecil Spring Rice, the British ambassador in Washington, fired off panicked cables to Whitehall, warning that if credit collapsed, Allies would be unable to pay for supplies, and the war effort would grind to a halt within weeks. David Lloyd George, who seized the British Prime Ministership in December 1916, understood the brutal mathematical reality. Britain could not win the war, and could not even maintain the Western Front, without total American financial and military intervention. Every diplomatic move, every territorial promise, and every strategic calculation from that moment forward, was filtered through a single overriding imperative: bring the full geopolitical and financial weight of the United States into the imperial orbit. While the Treasury in London was wrestling with mounting debts, Foreign Office was engaged in a desperate game, a secret territorial bargaining across the collapsing Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Turks, having entered the war on the side of Germany in late 1914, had to stride the most vital geopolitical choke points in the Eastern Hemisphere. For Britain, the greatest nightmare was a direct Ottoman strike across the Sinai Desert against the Suez Canal. The cause of canal was the spinal cord of the British Empire, thus from the narrow maritime artery connecting London to British India, Australia, and New Zealand. Suez flowed Indian soldiers, Australian wheat, Italian rubber, and Persian oil from the newly developed fields of Abadan. As Suez fell, the empire would be cut in two. Transport times would double, shipping insurance rates would skyrocket, and the logistics of imperial defense would shatter. To protect this arterial lifeline, British imperial planners pursued a policy of aggressive, contradictory, and overlapping commitments. In 1915, Sir Henry McMahon, British High Commissioner in Egypt, opened secret correspondence with Sharif Hussein of Mecca. Made expansive, roughly ambiguous promises. If the Arab tribes launched a desert revolt to tie down Ottoman divisions, Great Britain would recognize and support independent Arab sovereignty across vast swathes of the Middle East. Sharif Hussein believed the pledge, mobilizing thousands of Bedouin fighters who dynamited the Hejaz Railway, ambushed Turkish garrisons, protected the eastern flank of British forces in Egypt. Yet even as McMahon was drafting those letters in Cairo, two men were meeting in secret rooms in London and Paris to draw an entirely different map. Mark Sykes, representing the British War Cabinet, François-Georges Picot, representing the French Foreign Ministry, colored pencils, blank maps of the Levant and Mesopotamia. Sykes-Picot Agreement of May 1916, exercise in pure imperial carve-up. France claimed direct administrative control over coastal Syria, Lebanon, and Cilicia, alongside a vast sphere of economic influence stretching toward Mosul. Britain claimed direct control over southern Mesopotamia, parts of Haifa and Acre on the Mediterranean, Bosphorus, and a strategic belt of territory connecting the Persian Gulf to the sea. Palestine itself, home to holy sites contested by global powers, designated as an international condominium from a brown zone on the map, be administered jointly by Allied powers. Neither Mark Sykes nor Georges Picot consulted the populations living on those lands. Either man considered the promises McMahon had made to Sharif Hussein. Awesome, to the imperial mind, geography was not a living fabric of communities, cultures, and ancestral villages. It was real estate, strategic depth, and transit corridors. By early 1917, the British cabinet had promised the exact same territory, to the Arabs for their blood, to the French for their alliance. And yet, as the financial crisis in London worsened, Lloyd George realized that the Sykes-Picot arrangement had a fatal flaw. It left Palestine, the radical northern shield of the Suez Canal, outside exclusive British control. Britain needed a mechanism to tear up the internationalization clause of Sykes-Picot, exclude the French from the southern Levant, and secure permanent imperial dominion over the approaches to Suez. By the spring of 1917, the geopolitical landscape suffered a seismic rupture. And in March, the Russian Tsar was overthrown. The Western Front was dissolving into mutiny and socialist revolution, threatening to release hundreds of thousands of German troops to smash the Allied lines in France. In April 1917, the United States finally declared war on Imperial Germany, largely driven by unrestricted submarine warfare and the strategic imperative to protect billions of dollars in Allied war loans. However, yet American entry did not immediately solve Britain's financial agony. The American public remained deeply skeptical of European imperial ambitions. President Woodrow Wilson championed a rhetoric of national self-determination, openly hostile to traditional colonial land grabs. Furthermore, the United States Treasury, now advancing direct intergovernmental loans, expanded ruthless oversight of British expenditures, asking London to justify every dollar spent. Inside the British War Cabinet, a new strategic doctrine took shape. To secure its imperial objectives without alienating Washington, Britain needed a moral banner, a diplomatic instrument that aligned imperial self-interest with international political leverage. Weimar entered the Zionist movement, led by Dr. Chaim Weizmann, a biochemist whose industrial work on synthetic acetone had saved the British munitions industry from severe propellant shortages. Weizmann was not just a scientist. He was an extraordinary political operator who gained direct access to Arthur Balfour, colleagues from the Foreign Secretary, and David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister. Weizmann and his associates argued that imperial interests and Zionist aspirations were perfectly aligned. A Jewish national home in Palestine, under British protection, London with a permanent garrison shielding the Suez Canal, securing the Mediterranean terminus of future pipelines, tossing France out of the region. Simultaneously, British intelligence and cabinet ministers held an exaggerated, almost mystical belief in the geopolitical leverage of international finance and diaspora communities. Cabinet memos from 1917 reveal a calculated assumption: a dramatic British declaration in favor of Zionism would rally powerful financial and political support in the United States, keeping American loans flowing, counteracting pacifist sentiment. Simultaneously, Whitehall hoped such a declaration would persuade Russian revolutionaries, many of whom were assumed to be sympathetic to the movement, to keep Russia fighting on the Eastern Front. The British Empire was grasping at every available geopolitical lever. Palestine was no longer just territory. It was diplomatic collateral, headed in the high-stakes game of transatlantic financial mobilization. Drafting of the Declaration took place during the tense summer and autumn months of 1917, inside the paneled rooms of the War Cabinet at 10 Downing Street. It was not drafted in a single burst of ideological passion, but it was subjected to fierce internal debates, multiple redrafts, tactical negotiations. Remarkably, the most passionate opponent of the Declaration inside the British cabinet was its only Jewish member, Edwin Montagu, Secretary of State for India. In August 1917, Montagu submitted a blistering, classified memorandum titled The Anti-Semitism of the Present Government. Austria. Montagu argued with devastating foresight that establishing a national home based on religious identity create an intractable geopolitical crisis, disenfranchise the existing native population, place a permanent question mark over the citizenship and loyalty of Jewish communities living peacefully across Western nations. Montagu's fierce resistance forced the cabinet to pause and rewrite the text. Lord Walter Rothschild, prominent figure in the British banking dynasty and leader of the British Zionist community, also acted as the primary conduit between the Zionist leadership and the Foreign Office. Drafts circulated back and forth between Whitehall, after the Zionist organization, and American advisors close to President Wilson, including Justice Louis Brandeis. Every single noun was weighed like a financial clause in an international bond prospectus. The original Zionist draft requested that Palestine be recognized as the national home of the Jewish people. The British cabinet altered the phrasing to a national home in Palestine, deliberately introducing calculated legal ambiguity. Kate Montagu and addressed the obvious demographic reality on the ground, the cabinet inserted two critical safeguarding clauses. First, that nothing should be done which might prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Second, that nothing should prejudice the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. That is the extraordinary linguistic maneuver in the first clause. The Arab population has made up over 90% of the inhabitants of Palestine. In 1917, owning the vast majority of the land, was referred to merely as the existing non-Jewish communities. Their political and national rights were completely erased from the text, reduced strictly to civil and religious rights. October 31st, 1917, the cabinet formally approved the final text. 5 days later, on November 2nd, 1917, Arthur Balfour picked up his pen and signed the official letter addressed to Lord Rothschild. Thus, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. Cluster 67 words. An imperial promissory note, signed in a smoke-filled room in London, while British artillery batteries were preparing for the final assault on Gaza and Jerusalem. A month after the declaration was signed, General Edmund Allenby led the British-Egyptian Expeditionary Force into Jerusalem, dismounting from his horse to enter the Jaffa Gate on foot, presenting the image of a humble liberator. The Ottoman Empire in the Levant was broken. The British Empire had secured its buffer zone, established military control over the Suez approaches, and laid the groundwork for an exclusive League of Nations mandate. Financial and strategic gamble had delivered its immediate imperial objective. Britain occupied the land. Yet the ledger of history, unlike a bank balance, cannot be closed by simply transferring assets on paper. Fundamental contradiction embedded within British wartime diplomacy, every separate, irreconcilable promises made to the Arabs, French, and the Zionists exploded into immediate friction on the ground. In 1918, when Soviet revolutionaries published the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement from the Tsarist archives, Arab leaders realized they had been betrayed. The demographic reality of Palestine in 1917 was unmistakable. Hundreds of thousands of Arab peasants, merchants, and landowners cultivated the olive groves, terraced hillsides, and ancient cities for centuries, found that their political sovereignty had been signed away without their knowledge or consent. caused from. When the British military administration gave way to the British civil mandate in 1920, fault lines cracked wide open. Riots in Jerusalem in 1920, class violence in Jaffa in 1921, and the bloody clashes at the Western Wall in 1929, caused from were